Our next speaker is Mr. Mick Palmer, who joined the Northern Territory Police in 1963 and was appointed the Commissioner of the Northern Territory Police and Fire and Emergency Service in 1988. He served in that position until 1994 when he was appointed Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police, a position he held until his retirement in March 2001. He was the inaugural Deputy Chair of the National Council Against Drugs, has conducted a number of inquiries on behalf of the federal government, including in relation to the disappearance of Cornelia Rao. Would you please welcome Mick?
Thanks, Michael, very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank Alex for his, as usual, hugely factual sort of examples and explanation of the problems surrounding drug testing, random roadside drug testing in this country. As Michael said, I'm essentially a career police officer. I joined to join the Northern Territory Police in the days I did. You had to be male, 21 and single, and I was male, 21 and single. I joined what was really more of a frontier sort of police force in those days, rather than a traditional police force, a very small community. In numbers, in population terms, 1.4 million square kilometres of country, but we only had 165 police to police it. So you worked on your own. It was more like a patrol officer's job than a police officer's job outside of the towns such as Darwin, Alice Springs, Katherine and Tennant Creek. So for a young man, a young person, but in those days there were very few women in the Northern Territory Police. That's how old-fashioned and sexist it was, male, 21 and single. You had to get the permission of your district officer to get married. And I had a colleague whose choice of a bride-to-be was knocked back by his inspector, who didn't like the family. He ignored it, of course, but I mean, it was a different world, a different time. So when I joined it, I wasn't exactly pro-drug reform. As far as I'm concerned, you played the game, you took the knocks. If you committed a crime and I found out about it and I could prove it, well, I'd lock you up for it. That's the way I thought you did business. That was the way in which business tended to be done in the Northern Territory. So for me, it was an evolutionary journey. I wasn't a natural advocate for reform in that sense, but I think it's fair to say, I like to think anyway, that I was an advocate for justice and fair play and dealing with people appropriately and properly and taking action on the evidence and not on the fact that you didn't like somebody or you didn't like the habits they had. So an evidence-based approach is, I guess, what drove me and drove, I have to say, most of the colleagues with whom I worked in those early days. But a few things happened that changed my time. For me, it was an evolutionary journey to come to where I now am and where I have been, I think, for quite some time. But not long after some time after I joined, I suppose, in the early 1970s, I was then a detective sergeant. We were called to a house where neighbours had complained about a rowdy party, to find that the rowdy party was in fact a group of about 8 or 10 hippie-style people. In those days, hippies were the fashion, long hair, long beards, and plenty of caftans in sight, having a cannabis party. And it was mainly cannabis in those days, and not much else. Anyway, so we knocked on the door. They opened the door and welcomed us in, and we found heaps of bongs and cannabis laying around the place. So essentially, we arrested the whole house. We seized the bongs, we seized the cannabis, and away we went to court. The quantity of cannabis was quite significant in those days, although it was probably almost certainly just for the consumption of the party, the people who lived in the house, and there were quite a few. It put the possession offence into a Supreme Court category. So we finished up giving evidence in the Supreme Court. And I remember going to court, and the gentleman I'd arrested, when he came to the door and when I found him in possession of cannabis, he was dressed in a bright orange and black caftan. He had a great flowing beard and long hair. When he came to court, he came with his father, dressed in a beautiful suit, short back and sides, no sign of a beard. This really got up my nose. So when I was giving evidence, I then spoke to the accused, who at the time had long hair, had a long beard and was dressed in a caftan. The judge who was hearing the matter was the late Supreme Court Justice Jim Muirhead, who became famous later for the Black Deaths in Custody Commission of Inquiry, and in fact later became a great friend of mine, I'm pleased to say, I'm very proud to say. But I didn't know him then, and he didn't know me except to hear me give evidence. At the first break in the court proceedings, after I'd given this wonderful description about the fact that that's not what he normally looks like, and that's not what he looked like when we found him, the judge sent his associate down to say, would Detective Sergeant Palmer mind going to the judge's chambers? So up I go to the judge's chambers, and he said, look, thank you, Sergeant, for your evidence this morning. Thank you, sir. He said, but it isn't relevant to the charges that have been preferred against the accused that you talked about, that you arrested, as to what he looked like, what clothing he was dressed in, and whether or not he had a beard. So if you wouldn't mind in future refraining from the evidence, that sort of disclosure to the court, which may or may not have an impression on me but has nothing whatever to do with the charge, I'd be deeply appreciative. So deeply chastened, I walked back, but that had a big impact on me. I thought long and hard about that, and before the end of the trial, I spoke during the trial to the accused's father, who was a really decent sort of guy, an educated guy. He brought his son over to talk to me. He was a decent young guy, and I started to realise these were just decent young people who'd committed an act that had brought the attention of the neighbours and therefore the attention of police, and for which we had taken criminal action. But when I looked at it, it seemed to me there wasn't a great deal of sense in what we did, and it wasn't really achieving a great deal of value. He was convicted, he didn't go to prison, but he was given a probation and parole order, and it did impact on the career that he had intended, I think it intended to join the Defence Force, intended to pursue. What the end result of all that was, I don't know, but I know that in the first instance he was unsuccessful. In about 1978, 1979, I injured my back and I left policing, I thought, for good, and came down here to Brisbane to have surgery. I finished up not having surgery, but finding another way to deal with my problem. But while I was here, a colleague who was a lawyer from Darwin, who sadly died of cancer at about, within a year of giving me the advice, said, why don't you do the bar board examinations? At that stage I wasn't very mobile. He said, you're stuck at home, you can't do very much, you can study from home to do the bar board, why don't you do the bar board examinations and, try to become a barrister and go to the bar? So I did. I finished up being successful eventually, and I opened up chambers on the Gold Coast. The main reason for that was that I couldn't afford to open up chambers in Brisbane. I had a young family. My wife was working part-time as a travel, as a counter operator for a bus company, travel assistant, and so we were sort of struggling to raise two young children. So I went to the bar, I shared chambers with the guy, and in Queensland, as some of you may know, I think it's still the case, is that, Michael, there's a strict separation of professions. So there's a strict separation of professions in Queensland, which is not the case in New South Wales. So if you are admitted to the bar as a barrister, you can't deal directly with clients. You must have clients referred to you by a solicitor, and you can't sue. So you wait for referrals by solicitors, and then you act on behalf, so you're the voice in the court for the solicitor who otherwise acts for the client. And so although I, as an ex-police officer, wanted to do civil work because I didn't want to start acting and appearing for those guilty bastards, the lawyers very quickly found that I was an ex-police officer, and so for that reason I'd understand police practice, so they should throw criminal matters to me, despite the fact I didn't really want to do them. So I started to do them, and I found quickly that I liked them. And I found, of course, not only did I like them, I liked a lot of the clients that I found myself operating for. And I hadn't been at the bar very long when a very similar issue occurred that had occurred in the Northern Territory, where apparently police were called to a party. They found the place full of bongs and cannabis. Again, it was only cannabis. They arrested the whole household and they were put before the court. Legal Aid asked me would I appear for about half a dozen of the clients, so I found myself appearing for these clients in regard to use and possession of cannabis and cannabis implements and so on. And of course, in my preparation for the defence, they finished up, in fact, pleading guilty. The evidence was pretty overwhelming, pleading guilty, but so it was more a case of explaining the nature of the conduct and the reasons why the court should really show some leniency to these people in terms of the quality of the people they were, the nature of the offence they'd committed, and what their aims and strategies in life were. Some of them were intending to be teachers. One at least I know had applied for the Queensland Police Force. There were a couple of people who had applied for Defence Forces. And some were planning to go overseas to the United States. All of those things were going to be jeopardised, if not ruined, by a conviction, particularly in those days. This is in 1980, 81, where the United States just had an absolute closed door to a drug conviction meant you didn't come to my country, in the United States terms. So this became a pretty serious business. So in terms of arguing that case and arguing the cases for each of these young people, both male and female, again, the issue was reinforced with me that a lot about our drug policy doesn't make any sense, and I think we're not only focusing on the wrong people, but we're also dishing out punishments that have no reflection, no relationship to the crime that they are committing. And it's a crime only because somebody created a crime rather than being a crime against society as a whole. So my journey, if you like, was evolutionary, but it occurred to me reasonably quickly in my career. I then went back into policing after a couple of years at the bar on the Gold Coast. went back to the Northern Territory as the then Commissioner's legal advisor, and having corrected my back problem largely, and then went on to end my career in policing. But that experience, the experience at the bar and those early experiences with the reality of drug use on the ground really fashioned my thinking, I think it's fair to say, for the time to come. And fashioned my beliefs not only in terms of pill testing, which I'll talk about in a moment more specifically, as it is the focus of what we are talking about tonight, but in drug reform more generally. The reality is that policing has probably never been more effective in its history than it is now. We've never been better resourced than we are now. We've never had better technology at our fingertips than we are now. And in fact, in Australia's terms, the Western world tends to have more effective policing than the Eastern world. In general terms, Australia has some of the more effective policing in the world. At the end of the day, none of it makes any difference when it comes down to drug prohibition and drug laws. We don't make any difference. We make more seizures now than we've ever made. Some of those seizures are very, very significant, millions and millions of dollars worth of drugs. We make very significant arrests from time to time. We disband organised trafficking groups. We have better levels of cooperation across international boundaries with the United States, with Europe, with the United Kingdom and so on. We have police. The AFP now has police in something like 30-odd countries around the world. In my time it was something like 22. We had liaison officers spread right across the world, including places like Bogota in Colombia and Myanmar. Those sort of countries where they're at the coalface of what's happening. Despite all those connections, despite the level of intelligence sharing, despite the effectiveness of policing in statistical terms, we've been completely ineffective. We haven't changed user levels, supply levels, we haven't changed demand levels, we haven't moved use down, and we certainly haven't minimised harm. As Alex was talking about, the whole basis, the whole aim of our illicit drug policy is to minimise harm, reduce harms. We've never done that in our history. In my view, there's no chance that we can arrest or prohibit our way out of the reality of our drug culture. And the sooner we recognise that and find new ways to do business and look at new options by which we may achieve better results, the better, frankly. Too many people have been harmed. We're aggravating the very problem we're trying to solve. And the sooner the politicians and wider society comes to really recognise the reality of the world in which we live and why it is important that we look at new ways to do business, the better. When it comes to pill testing, to me, pill testing is a classic example of the sort of things I'm talking about. I mean, if we look at the reality, and I was drawn again slowly to pill testing. I mean, I'd never heard of it until towards the end of my career. Pill testing was something that was really quite recent in this country. And so it was in embryo stages before I left policing. I didn't understand much about it. I didn't know much about it. I didn't really have too much sympathy for it. Didn't think it was going to solve many problems. But the more, of course, as with most things, the more you look at something and the more you think about it and the more you study it and reflect upon it, the more you realise if it makes sense, if it does make sense, that it does make sense. And the reality for me, the journey for me was this. The reality is that the vast majority of people who go to festivals, first of all, we run a lot of festivals in this country and have for many years, and they are great fun. Young people love them, mainly young people. They're everything that is good about life. It's all about fun and a festival party environment. We should be encouraging and embracing that sort of environment rather than trying to find ways of how we should shut them down. So festivals have always been and are an increasingly big part of Australian life, in summer particularly. The vast majority of people who go to festivals are decent, educated, employed young Australians, mainly young Australians, male and female. I'm not saying in any sense that if you haven't got a job, therefore you're not worth counting, but I'm saying, unlike other areas of drug use, they're not marginalised people who are suffering other problems, who are homeless or out of work, coming out of divided or abusive families, or have some mental illness or other sort of problems that tend to cause people to get involved in a drug situation. These are generally just middle-of-the-road Australians that have a job, that are going to university, that come out of families that are pretty supportive, that are just going out for a good night. The very vast majority of those, on all the evidence, would never ever come to the attention of police if it was not for being found with a drug in their possession at a festival. They're not likely to come across police in their ordinary working. They're not out there breaking into homes. They're not stealing cars. They're not committing other crimes likely to draw attention to themselves. They just simply go to a festival, do a few things that we prefer perhaps they don't do, and as a result of that get picked up and caught by police. So the reality is, a lot of people go to festivals. Most of them are really decent young Australians. Whether we like it or not, a very significant percentage of those decide to take drugs because that's going to make the night even better than what it was before. And in my youth it was alcohol, and I did my share of that. I mean, it is really no difference. The commodity has changed, the mindset is exactly the same. We're going out for a great night, how do we make it greater? How do we make sure we maximise the enjoyment? And whether we like it or not, this is something that most Australians, most young Australians are likely to do. That's happening now. That's happening now, and there was mention earlier on, I think, of the Splendour in the Grass environment, a festival that occurred down at Byron Bay just very recently, where numbers of arrests were made. That's happening now in an environment where everybody knows the drugs are prohibited. It's unlawful to have them in your possession or to use them, where there's a very heavy police presence and visible police presence, often a saturation police presence, and where there are very frequently large numbers of sniffer dogs. It doesn't matter. People still take the risk. They still try to get through the cordon. They're still prepared to have a go. That is the reality. It's not a case of if we let go and we allow pill testing, they'll start taking drugs to festivals. Hey, they're taking drugs to festivals now in very, very large quantities and in very large numbers. And they're buying it from each other. The reality as well at the moment is that if they happen to see police approaching when they're in a group and they have drugs they're going to take, far more likely, as has happened on a number of occasions, that they'll get rid of them in the best way they can, which sometimes means swallowing 2 or 3 tablets rather than one that you intended to make sure the police don't find them in your possession. If one of their colleagues gets ill, they're much more likely, whether it be paramedics or police that turn up, to tell lies as to what's wrong with them, because if they tell the truth, they know they're going to get into strife. So they pretend they've got food poisoning, or they pretend they've got a virus, and it takes some time before the paramedics sometimes even work out what it is that is in reality wrong with the person. So we're wasting valuable time. They don't see police as supporters and as protectors with whom they should engage and with whom they should share the reality of what's occurring. They see them as the enemy, people who are there to punish, not to protect. It puts young police officers in a completely unenviable situation. I mean, the reality as part of this current environment is this. The vast majority of police who go to these festivals, who are given the job of policing festivals, are young men and women. Quite a significant number of those would be social drug users. Police are no different to the wider society. Some of the people at the festival would be off-duty police officers, some of whom would be using, and I don't have empirical evidence about this, but I can say very confidently, some of them would be using drugs. It is the nature of the beast. It's the world in which we live. So that is the reality that we're now dealing with. And so we've got to say, what are the outcomes of that environment? The outcomes of that environment are that people are taking drugs over which they have no control. They have no knowledge of the content of the drug, what the components of the drug are, whether it really was MDMA when they bought it or whether it wasn't. The evidence when the testing occurs shows that in over half the cases it's likely not to be what they believed it to be. They have no idea of the toxicity of the drug they take. They have no way of finding out the components or the toxicity. If they get ill as a result of it, they know they're playing with dynamite. If they run quickly to a paramedic and seek advice, they may well cause trouble for themselves and their colleagues. And so everything about the environment is unhealthy, and none of it is about minimising harms. If we could turn that on its head and say, that's the reality at the moment. We're not stopping people going to festivals and taking drugs. We're not stopping the harms that are created by that. I mean, the level of hospitalisations coming out of many of these festivals is very high. There was a case, for example, in the United Kingdom in 2016 where in the United Kingdom, for the first time, they allowed pill testing at the festival. The level of hospitalisations in the year they allowed pill testing was 95% lower than it had been the year before. 95% lower than the hospitalisations, drug-related hospitalisations, a year before at the same festival. If you can change the environment, we might well surprise ourselves as to the value of the process that we get. So if we had a situation where the same people going to the same drugs, those same decent young Australians going in large numbers to a festival, many of whom carrying drugs, but we said as part of the process, you can actually, if you're determined to come along with drugs and you intend to use them, how about you test them before you do, to find out what you're taking and listen to what the guys tell you, what the people tell you as to what the dangers might be in doing what you're intending to do. And if as part of that process, as proof is now in many countries across Europe and increasingly across in Canada and now parts of the United States, many people avail themselves of that opportunity. Nobody goes to a festival wanting to die. They might want to be high and take a risk and live life dangerously, but you don't intend to kill yourself in very many cases. And so it makes sense to get the pill tested. Now, there's no doubt in the world that in Australia so far, where we've only had a couple of examples where this has been allowed to occur, one person will go on behalf of the group. So if we all go together, we might draw the straw, and if I draw the short straw, I'll go across on behalf of all of us, having a sample of the tablets we all have to see what it's like. So I go back and report to all of us. So although there might only be, say, 100 or 150 people tested, they probably represent 400 or 500 people on whose behalf they're getting the pill tested. And they'll be told what the components of the pill are, what the dangers associated with the use of the pill is, why they should think twice about doing it, what the harmful signs, if they still decide they should go ahead and use it or they intend to go ahead and take the pill, what the harmful signs will be if they occur, and what the hell they should do about it if they do occur. Now, none of that is a negative. None of that is encouraging drug use. In fact, quite the reverse. It's giving people damn good reasons as to why they should think twice about what they intend to do. In all of the countries in Europe that I've read evidence on, where this process occurs, and in some cases, and it's now across a number of what we would see as conservative countries. The Netherlands has a pretty open-minded attitude to drugs, and as you know, as many of you would know, has had it for a long time. But certainly Germany hasn't, and Austria hasn't, and Switzerland hasn't. There are a range of countries now that are very conservative countries that have embraced it not only in terms of pill testing, but embraced it in terms of consumption rooms and the equivalent of MSIC, medical supervised injecting centres, and have had wonderfully positive results as a result of having that attitude, saying we're not going to stop this happening by prohibition, we're not going to arrest our way out of this, we've got to find a better way to protect and support the people who still have intentions of doing what we would rather they don't do. If they intend to take pills, how do we best protect them? How do we best make sure that nobody goes home in a body bag and make sure they go home safely to their family and their parents? If that's the motivating factor, and it should be, what other motivating factor could a decent, intelligent society have? Well then, pill testing is a very significant way by which we can aid and assist that process. All the evidence coming out of those countries in Europe is that use is moderated. I think in an Austrian study recently, the main testing agency for festival testing reported 2/3 of people who had their drugs tested discarded the drugs. In Canada, I think in 2015, 1/3 of people said they didn't, having had their drugs tested, said they didn't intend to use them. And they're very significant figures. As I said, the festival in the United Kingdom, 95% reduction in hospitalisations. All of that is positive stuff. As Alex said quite properly, we're not going. This is no panacea. We could have pill testing introduced tomorrow and have a death at the first festival. Not everybody's going to assume is going to take the chance to have their pills tested. Some people are going to take a risk anyway. But we are so much better off if we have an availability to give people the advice. If we've got a way by which we can reduce the risks by having the quality control and the toxicity control, we can provide information and knowledge we don't presently provide as to what the dangers are, as to what they should look for in terms of warning signs if they were to continue to take the drug. And if we have a situation where the police are seen to be there to protect and support the safety of drug users, all festival goers, including drug users, rather than to lock up those they can find with drugs in their possession. And that's been the attitude taken, I have to say, by the AFP and the ACT, group moving in the groove pill festivals, where the police have been there in support of the intentions and aims of the people conducting the pill testing. How sensible is that? I mean, police exercise discretion all the time. We don't arrest everybody we find. A lot of discretion that is exercised by police is very sensible discretion. And we make lots of decisions that say, well, I could arrest it as a technical offence, but it wouldn't make any sense to do so. And this is no different. Of course we can exercise discretion. New South Wales, for example, and they've got a fairly traditional attitude to some of this, but New South Wales Police, way back in as early as before 1996, before 2000, had a policy which told police officers, if you like, on the ground that this is the way in which they wanted them to exercise their discretion. That if somebody was called to, and it was mainly heroin in those days, somebody was called to a heroin overdose, and there were a number of people there, you didn't search the people who were with the person who was suffering the overdose, and you didn't take any action against them, even if it was obvious they were high, because that would mean next time they wouldn't phone you. So in other words, you used a common sense approach, and they exercised the discretion very positively. In the same way as with the MSIC that Alex mentioned in King's Cross. Police have been supporting that. It's now nearly 20 years old, probably is 20 years old. Well over 1 million people have used the MSIC. Police know firsthand what the results of that are. There's been 0 deaths. a downturn in hospitalisations and overdoses. Many people who have decided not to continue, been given rehabilitative assistance and have taken a different path and have weaned themselves off what was a serious addiction. You know, it won't work in every case. It's not a perfect solution, but all of the signs say, wow, what a positive initiative this was. And Bob Carr deserves a great big tick for that, frankly. And how ridiculous it is in a country as educated as ours and in other ways sophisticated as ours, we still only have one other one in the country, and that's in Richmond in Victoria. As Alex said, you'd think we'd have a dozen around the country because the evidence screams out at you that, wow, that's a smart thing to do. That might save lives. That might change people's habits. That might give them a better future than we presently apply to them. You know, we demonise, we punish, we demonise and we isolate the very people we should be protecting and supporting. That's what's dramatically wrong with our drug policy more broadly. It's what's wrong in the more micro sense with pill testing. There's almost no downside to trialling pill testing. What's to be lost by politicians being prepared to bite the bullet and say, let's give it a go for 12 months. Let's try it for 2 years. And let's see what results we do get. Let's see if we get the outcomes they're getting in Europe. They look pretty positive to me. You know, we know what the outcomes are we're getting in our current policy, and it isn't very good. There were a couple of figures bandied around today, but I think Alex said that one of the latest reports indicated not, as we thought, 60 or 70 people who've died from in those circumstances over the last 10 or so years from drug use at places like festivals and nightclubs, but hundreds. You know, the reporting system is imperfect. People aren't really quite sure what the figures are. People sometimes go home and then get crook and die, and so that's not reported and it's not collected the same way. There's no register, so the figures are imperfect, but the reality is the figures are disturbing, and almost all of these people are otherwise young, healthy, middle-of-the-road Australians. They're not people with huge addiction problems. They're not people who otherwise, you know, are unemployable because they've got a serious drug problem or another mental illness problem that's creating for them great underlying problems. These are just middle-of-the-road Australians having a social pill like I went and had a social drink. And sometimes my drinks weren't always that social. Went on far too damn long, you know, but you couldn't have told me that at 21 or 22 years of age. It was good fun, as silly as it was, and as dangerous as it was. But unless I committed some offence, I wasn't committing an offence. I could go to a hotel, I could drink too much alcohol, and unless I committed some other offence, I wasn't going to draw attention to myself. The difference here now, of course, is that we've created illegality around products that really are not as dangerous as the alcohol I'm talking about, and that allows us to demonise, isolate and punish. None of that, it seems to me, makes any sense at all.